The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes to let people log on before we get started. Okay, I think it's time to get started. Hi, and welcome to today's session, From Requirements to Procurement, How to Select an Agile Work Management Platform. I'm Kenzie Fetzer, and I'll be kicking us off today. We partnered with some excellent speakers for today's webinar. Presenting will be Greg Johnson, industry veteran and Agile assessment and implementation expert. Towards the end of the webinar, we'll be joined by Al Shalloway, founder and CEO of Net Objectives, to share some tactical feedback from real-life implementations. Before we start, let's take care of some housekeeping. We will be accepting questions during this webinar. To ask a question, just type it into the chat feature in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar, and we'll follow up over email with any questions that we aren't able to get to today. We are recording this webinar, and we will share the video afterwards. And all registrants will also receive our tools assessment checklist after the webinar as well. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Greg Johnson.
Thank you, Kenzie. I'd like to start off with just an overview of what we're going to present today. We'll go over the agenda quickly. So I'll be talking with Al interjecting a couple of times with his point of view for the first 30 to 35 minutes of this webinar. And what we're going to go over is the best way to approach your Agile Work Management Platform assessment. I'll give an overview of the assessment process, talk about the role and importance of having a steering committee involved, and give some ideas of best practices for finalizing and ranking your evaluation criteria so that you have a useful result from your assessment, and discussing implementation, training, and rollout, some best practices we've seen when folks are rolling out a large system. Then we'll spend time on some real world examples, both good and bad. I think Al and I have both had a lot of experience with seeing Agile Work Management platforms in use. And then we'll leave 15 minutes for questions and wrap up. So to start with, I want to talk about how to approach your Agile Work Management assessment. The first thing you need to do is to really look in at your own organization and review your past tool experiences. Most organizations have used several different Agile platforms or point tools or task management tools. So understand the experience you have in-house. Learn from the folks that have done this either ad hoc or maybe in previous roles at different organizations. And then take a real honest look at your current situation. Where are you, both in terms of your current Agile processes, maturity, and where you want to be down the road. Have a vision of your future state. Understand what you think will change. Don't plan too far ahead for the future, because it usually turns out we expect things are going to happen faster than they are. But so focus mainly on where you're at today, but also where you want to go. I also want to emphasize this next point. I've been involved with several uh, both mid to medium scale and large scale agile assessments where the mind of the people who are making the decision or who are actually going to be asked to purchase the platform, they'd already made up their minds. They did an assessment or asked for an assessment only to get a stamp of approval on what they've already decided. If that's your case, don't bother with the assessment because it's just going to turn into a political battle where the people who know what tool they want are trying to convince others why their other tools are not going to work. So if your mind is already made up, don't even bother with an assessment. I'm just going to start with that. I've just seen that too many times. Provide ample time, anywhere from 4 weeks if it's a smaller organization with just a couple hundred seats, and as long as up to 4 months if this is a several thousand, 5,000 seats spread across a large organization. You need time to assess all the needs of the different divisions and departments and groups and the different roles. And I'll talk about that later on, how we go about finding out the needs of those different groups. And that's done through our internal research and interviews, which are incredibly important. Most people want to jump right to looking at the platforms and tools out there. From my experience, I would just suggest no, look internally first, understand your organization, understand your experiences before you start looking externally. So we're going to start today with the poll. I'd like to know what your role is in assessing an Agile work management platform. So if you could go ahead, Kenzie, and bring up that poll, we'll go ahead and see what people's experience, what their role is in this process. And I'll give us about 30 seconds. It shouldn't take too long to answer this question. And hopefully I'll be able to see some of the results. And if I can't see them, I'll have Kenzie read them out to me before we go on. So please take about another 10 or 15 seconds and click on your role, and then we'll keep going. I'm hoping that was enough time for most people. So if we could close that out and we'll take a look at the results here. Yeah, it is a little too small for me to read. It looks like 10% is the first category of you're actually a buyer making a decision. It looks to me like around 15% of you are users who want your team to have a tool. 20% are the actual decision makers. Great. And then we've got a whole host of other roles. One thing we could do is because there's so many in the other roles, I think we'd be fine if just in the either the question or the chat screen, you just kind of describe your role. If you think it's an important role that we missed, that would be awesome. And then later on, Kenzie can pass those on to me. But thank you for filling this out. This is informative. Looks like we've got a decent amount of folks who are the decision maker and a smattering throughout, but I am curious about that other role. So we'll move on into the presentation. So another key consideration here is that when you're looking at any new platform, I remember one of the organizations I worked at when we switched from Outlook to Gmail, it was a huge political, sensitive, big switch. There was lots of arguments on both sides. So when you're either going to a new platform or going to your first platform, I want you to be aware this is a very sensitive, political, and a decision that's you cannot satisfy everyone. And everyone has a stake in the game. Even folks that are not going to use the tool or the platform, they're going to get the results from it. They have a stake in the game. They have certain expectations of reports and data and metrics they want to get out of it. And I also want to emphasize, there's no right answer. I've actually been in this industry now for Agile tools and work management platforms for almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years early next year. And I've worked at some of the larger vendors. I've also done assessments for many, many years. I've seen lots of implementations. I've seen good, bad. So I want to say this, there is no right answer. There isn't one platform that is the best. It really depends on where your organization is and what you need. So it's important to take your time and do this right. And keep in mind that people's careers are at stake here. If someone manages a work management platform or tool, often that's somebody's full-time job. So think about that when you're doing these assessments, and hopefully find if these people can fit into the new platform that you move to, and if they can help out with that. Let's go over the assessment process. You're going to get at the end of the webinar a far more detailed PDF document that has this in detail. It's got a summary of all the information I'm going to go over today, so you can use it as a checklist to help yourself out when you're doing this, but I'll just go over it briefly. First thing you do is to get together a group, a steering committee to guide your evaluation. That can be for small organizations, just as many as 1 or 2 or 3 people. I would say 2 minimum, so you've got a couple of folks to discuss things with. For large organizations, I've seen as many as 6 or 7 people on this steering committee. That committee is responsible for defining some principles to guide your assessment. I'll talk about principles soon after this. And start with internal research. Be honest about your organization's Agile maturity. Is everyone in the organization following the same process? Is it ad hoc Agile? Is it moved? Are there different organizations doing it their own way? What tools have your teams used? And start with interviews. I highly recommend interviewing everyone from end users who are tactical contributors, dev, QA, POs, Scrum Masters, to executives, managers, if you're program managers, Agile release train managers throughout the organization, as well as people in the PPM or PMO organization who are going to be using this information or maybe even accessing the system. So have a whole series of interviews and work from a script. From that, you can determine what success will look like for your organization. And then becomes the work. Really, now that you've done the research and you've looked at some analyst reports, you've looked at some websites of tools, you've internally interviewed anyone, now you decide what are your evaluation criteria, what are the features you need. So you need to decide what they are, prioritize and weight them or rank them, and then narrow your scope to hopefully just 2 or 3, at most 4 tools, evaluate them and score them. I'll talk about that process in greater detail as we go on, and then you need to make a decision, implement it, and train your users. So we'll go over all that in greater detail. So the steering committee, this is incredibly important. You should not be having an individual, one person in charge of your evaluation. And whoever is maybe doing the bulk of your research and scoring the tools should be an independent, unbiased individual, not someone who is behind one of the tools or is administering one of the tools. At that point, it's not a very biased evaluation. So if you don't have somebody internal in your organization, look for somebody external who doesn't have a vested interest in the choice of your tools, and the steering committee can work with them. So the steering committee starts by defining principles to guide their assessment. They help with internal research, and what I mean by help is they facilitate it. In large organizations, it's often very difficult to interview higher level executive and VPs. I know in several of my assessments, there were folks that I couldn't get on their calendar for 6 or 8 weeks, and even then it was just a 20 or 30-minute call. So they should make those people available to the interviewer or researcher for the assessment as early as possible, and also help decide which divisions, groups, individuals, end users, sometimes outside groups who are helping with your development, they can interview, and make that easier. But start with that internal research. Look at externally industry analyst reports, any other information you have, white papers, include all that. From this, you can come up with this evaluation criteria and review these tool ratings, which we'll talk about. The steering committee also will make the final recommendation. It is not up to, if you have an individual who's actually running the scoring or the assessment of the tools, it is the committee's job then to take that information and, whether unanimously or by vote, decide what platform they should go with. And they should also provide guidance and oversee some of the implementation, configuration, and training. So I talked about principles. What are these principles to guide your process? I'm just going to start. The best way, I think, to talk about principles to guide the process is to show you some. So these are examples of principles I've seen organizations choose in the past. One is that the tool should assist with guiding teams as they adopt Agile practice. Another principle is we want this to work well with open source tools. We want it to have a robust API so that we can access it and integrate it with other tools. It needs to integrate with specific platforms or tools as well. These are all principles that I've seen folks want to ensure that any platform they choose has. Another principle is transparency and visibility at all levels, not just for those using the tool across their teams and groups and programs, but all the way up to executive business level. And you have to decide how important that is to your organization before you even begin your evaluations. And then there's cloud, of course, or SaaS-based versus on-premise deployment. What does your organization need? I've seen as many as 6 or 10 principles and as few as 3 or 4 that guide a process, but that'll help you when you pick the actual features and criteria. You'll look at your principles and decide how important they are when you rank them.
Hi, this is Al. I
yeah.
just wanted to interject one thing Greg mentioned to clarify. If you can go back one slide.
Sure.
On this tool should help guide teams adopting Agile practices. He does not mean you're following the tool. What he means is the tool is providing you information that will help the teams adopt Agile practices. I just wanted that to be clear. Nowhere are we ever suggesting that people follow tools. It's rather how does the tool support the teams and other parts of the organization. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Al. And you know, I brought that up as one of the discussion points here is that the tool definitely is not going to teach people how to use Agile, but it should make things visible to them. And these are just possible discussion points that you'll ask as a steering committee around that. Another example here is around that transparency and visibility. So things you'll want to talk is, will our PPM or PMO teams, will they actually use the platform, or they would just get the results of the data from it? And one key thing I've seen, having done many of these over the last few years, is that probably the two tendencies are providing flexibility and allowing the team to pick any tool they want, which is a basic Agile principle, balancing that with the organization's need to plan work, to adjust priorities, monitor progress, and track value delivery, which pretty much assumes that you have the same platform, because it's difficult to prioritize work if it's all stored in multiple tools. So this is a balance I've seen organizations struggle with, letting those teams pick the tools they want versus having the organization having an effective governance program to roll up information. So bring these up, be clear about these when you come up with your principles, discuss them with your steering committee. I talked about the importance of internal research and interviews, and I'm a stickler for actually creating an interview script. Decide what you want to learn in the interviews. These are examples I have on the right here of things you may want to learn, what tools have been used across different groups. Decide who you should interview. I would suggest a smattering of roles. All the roles that will be using the platform should be interviewed, and deciding, it's very important, on who is going to conduct the interview. Someone who's unbiased and will ask questions in a way to really uncover and learn and not lead to a desired outcome that they have. I've got some other examples of questions you can ask. These are questions around Agile metrics. And one thing I'll talk about when I talk to organizations about features, initiatives, epics, it's really clear that you have them defined. I have noticed that even within an organization, the description and definition of a feature or an initiative or an epic can be completely different in the same organization. So when you ask these questions, make sure you're clear on what you're asking and what those questions, what those definitions mean to your organization. Another example of questions I would ask are, how hard is it to manage the platform? How difficult is it to support your users? How many folks does it take to configure and maintain this particular platform? So keep this in mind. Some platforms and tools are very easy to support. They're very lightweight. But then again, they may not provide this roll-up of information you need. Others provide a nice, clear path to guiding your users as well as rolling up information, but they may take a lot of work to administer. So make sure in your interview questions, you interview some folks who either have administered the platforms you're considering or have experience, or you learn that from the vendors in your research, because this is a key part in determining how your total cost of ownership and the difficulty of maintaining and upgrading the system. So how do you define success? You've done a lot of research now. You've interviewed folks internally. You may have had an idea of what success was when you started this. Typically, when the steering committee forms, they've got a vision of what it's going to look like in the future. But as you get more information and interview people, it is very common that your vision of success will change. So I would say halfway, 2/3 of the way, somewhere in the middle of your evaluation, you should now have a good idea of what success will look like for your organization, and you should document it. You should talk about adoption rates by role, daily, weekly usage by role. What do we expect? How about the reports and the metrics? What do we expect will come out of the tool? Where do we think we'll have to use integrations to massage and combine data? What specific results? Are we looking at just getting the ability to prioritize work more easily and to steer and make changes more easily? Are we looking at reductions in costs? Are we looking at savings in time? And if so, across what roles? You should define all these things so that when you do put this platform in place, you can define if it's successful. Another key point here is there's a lot of tools out there that are really intuitive and developers love using them. But what if non-technical people need to access the platform? Is there a user interface or a way for them to access and understand it? Are their needs different from technical users? Oftentimes, developers, QA folks want to integrate with the tools they use daily, their IDEs, their Jenkins, their Hudson, their build platforms. So clearly their GitHub. How important is that versus non-technical users being able to get the reports out? All these need to be considered when you talk about defining success for your organization. Once you do that, make sure you create that. It can be as simple as a one-page document, even a couple paragraphs, but you should document it, make it clear so that when you do get this in place, you know whether you've succeeded or not. So how do you define and discover your evaluation criteria? I'm going to talk about the tactical way to do that. I think you should take you'll have starting expectations, like we definitely need to see this type of report. We need to be able to create burn downs. We need to be able to roll up burn downs at any level, from program to Agile release train down to teams. We need to be able to track where stories are, where features are, where epics are. All those type of evaluation criteria should be documented. And I've seen as many as 60 to well over 100 specific features or capabilities that organizations want. And that's fine, but what you need to do then is group them into evaluation categories. Broad categories, I would say between 3 and 5, maybe as many as 6 or 7 or 8, but no more than that. So create these broad categories, put the features and capabilities under them, and then prioritize, rank these categories. Don't try to rank every single feature. It's going to turn into a nightmare of a spreadsheet with literally hundreds of rows and notes and specific capabilities of how different tools do it. That level of analysis is far too technical and detailed. What you're looking for is coming up with those 5 to 7 broad categories, rank and weight them, and I'll show you in a minute here how I suggest you do that. And then, and this is, by the way, done by the steering committee. The steering committee will debate and decide which of these categories are more important, and they should rank them. I prefer quantitative rankings, giving them a numerical ranking of how important each of these evaluation criteria are. Then, and only then, should you actually begin looking at tools and platforms that are out there. Take your time, perform your assessment. This could be as much as 3 to 5 weeks of your evaluation period. Do a good job ranking these tools. Bring this back to the steering committee. Show them where you're at. Give them updates throughout the process. And you've hopefully narrowed this down to 2 or 3 tools, so this is a manageable process. Let's take a look. I talked about some evaluation criteria. Let's run a poll here. I'd like to talk about what these are broad categories of capabilities that you'd be looking for in an Agile work management platform. I'd like to see maybe what the top 3 are. If you could pick the top 3 in this poll, and then hopefully we can summarize that and see what is of interest. Now, I know there's many others that I don't have here. I don't have total cost of ownership. I don't have specific metrics or reports. These are broad categories, but I'm curious what our audience today thinks is very important, the top 3, when they evaluate an Agile work management platform. And think about the platforms you have in place today, maybe what you don't have that might impact your decision. And I'll give us another 10 or 15 seconds, and we'll take a look at the poll results. So hopefully people are close to finishing. We'll give you about 5 more seconds, and we'll go ahead and display a summary of the poll. And let's see what we have. So now I don't see the results. Kenzie, are they up? There they go. There they go. Now I can't read those numbers. It looks like it looks like it's spread pretty evenly. Almost all of these. There's one that tends to stick out. I believe the second one, extensibility and configurability, seems to be the highest.
And then we've got reports and visualizations at 88%.
Oh, I couldn't see that. Thank you. So that is definitely the highest. Reports and visualizations, great. And the lowest on this one tends to be UX and usability by role. Interesting. So that's important to me. So what's far more important to people is getting the visualizations and the reports they need out of this. Even have far more heavily weighted than metrics and reports. So this is great. So this is something you'll do with your steering committee. And whether you do this, most of the organizations I've worked, we've done this right out in the open rather than anonymous, and we debated and we came back, and it took several times. It's taken several weeks to do this because we start off with all the features. A lot of the debate has been over what categories we should narrow it down to and what features go in what categories. Once we had that done, it usually gets pretty easy to rank these. So that's great. This is useful. So you're getting a feel for how we'd go about doing this. So now we have to evaluate the options. You take a look at the tools. This is how I suggest you do it. You can do it in many ways, but I've just picked several possible broad categories. The steering committee has decided how to weight these categories. This is a scale of 1 through 5 over here in the tool number weight column. So they weight each of the categories. I didn't rank them from top to bottom in this particular example, but you can see the most important in this organization is visualizations and reports, as well as scaled Agile metrics and reports. After that is extensibility and configurability, as well as scalability. And last is integrations and 3-year total cost of ownership. Then each of the tools are ranked. If it's a team or an individual doing the evaluation, they come up with an actual numerical ranking of how well that particular platform does there, and you multiply the weight times that tool's capability, come up with a score, and you add them all up. Now, in this particular example, there's quite a wide spread. Tool number 1 is got 77 total points. That should be tool number 2 in the last column. I apologize. That has 54. One thing I've noted is you may come in with tools that are just a few points apart from each other. At that point, it's probably okay to say we need to have it narrowed down to these 2 and dig in a little deeper and maybe do one last round of assessment to dig deeper into the categories. But in this case, I think it'd be pretty clear which tool seems to be the best choice for this organization. And Something I haven't spent a lot of time on is I talked about getting industry analyst reports and using those as well as your internal research and then the assessment. But I do want to talk about the fact that, industry analysts have their own way of looking at things. They will clearly rank a particular platform or tool as much higher than all the others. But keep in mind, they are doing this in a very broad fashion for all of their customers. It is impossible for them to understand the specific needs of your organization and how important they are. So use industry analyst reports as input for ranking some of your categories, but don't rely on them to choose a tool for you. I would never do that because many organizations, some of the things that are important in those industry analyst reports are completely not even important to your organization. So figure out what your organization needs, what your agile and lean processes are, how important that visibility is, and the metrics, reports, and visualizations. One tool could be ranked incredibly low in that area by an analyst, but because they have a very specific metric or report or visualization capability that you need, it ranks much higher. So just blindly taking what an industry analyst report or a white paper or something says is the best is not the way to go. Take a look at your organization, then make your decision. So now that you've made your decision, come up with an implementation schedule, and then, if necessary, and I highly recommend it, have a training schedule for the tool rather than just throwing it out there. Now, there's lots of ways to roll thing out. This picture is meant to indicate an ad hoc way. In other words, hey, the tool's available. Please start using it when you want. I've seen organizations just send out an email with an announcement. Our tool is available. You can all start using it. Here's some guidelines on how to use it, and let teams adopt it as they see fit. I've also seen the big bang approach, where an organization says, on this date, we will switch over. All 2,700 users will begin using this, so be prepared. And I've also seen a phased approach, where one program or one team, maybe 100, 150 users, uses it for 8 or 12 weeks, goes through a release cycle, learns a lot of lessons. Then they go and do this with 3 or 5 larger teams, another 300 to 500 people, and then finally they roll out to the organization. Of these 3, I have found the phased approach to be by far the best way to do this. I see a question here. I'll make sure I get to that in just a minute, and I'll be happy to answer that. But one thing I just want to emphasize is I definitely don't support the ad hoc approach of just letting people switch to it when they want to. Big bang, not my favorite, but it's better than letting teams adopt it as they see fit. But I recommend using a phased approach, deciding how to phase it in. Pick your most experienced agile lean teams, go through it with them. You'll learn some lessons. Then you should document how the tool is used to align with your process, put some training in place, then roll it out to more teams. So that's my suggestion. I have a question here. What is a reasonable implementation time for a 100-person installation? I would say that 100 folks could be implemented probably, let's say your assessment takes 4 to 6 weeks, because it wouldn't take that long for a fairly small assessment of that size, and should take another 4 weeks, maybe 8 weeks to implement. Part of it is letting people finish their current release cycle on their current tools, and then having a date. For a group that small, you could probably do a big bang approach, switch them all over in 4 to 8 weeks. So total process is probably 2-3 months after the assessment, the decision, and another 4 to 8 weeks before implementing. So we're going to end with one last poll question, and then we're going to give some real world examples and take questions. So we'd like to just know, what size organization are you? So when we go through our examples, we'll have a better feel for our audience today. And once again, this should take 20 to 30 seconds. So please check the best fit. I know these aren't perfect and there's some overlap, but go ahead and pick whatever you think aligns best for your organization. And we'll give this about another 10 seconds, and we'll take a look at the results. All right, let's see what we have for results. Okay, well, we've got a lot of folks from a large organization, about that's probably the biggest group, and then single department, 100 to 500. So we definitely are weighted towards larger organizations, and about a quarter of the folks are in small groups. So I'll make sure that we give plenty of real world examples of large organizations and single departments of up to 500 users. We'll spend a lot of our real world examples there, but I'll also give at least one example of smaller groups as well, satisfy those folks. So let's talk about some of our real world examples. I'm going to break them into these three categories. I'll just go right into the first one. I'll give my first example, and then I'm going to let Al just expound and talk, because he has a lot of experience, more from a coaching perspective, but I think he's seen a lot of things. So I'll just start with a very successful assessment I was once a part of a couple years back. So this is a very large Fortune 500 organization. They had multiple tools in place, 3 different platforms. One was clearly used by the most folks, well over a couple thousand people. We had another platform that was used by more than 500 folks. This was a result of an acquisition. And then there was more of a team level tool where there was multiple hundreds of people using it in several separate installations. So all 3 of these were in use. Now, the good news in this organization is they did not go in with having decided which tool they want. They were open-minded, and we did come up decide what their principles were early on. We had a very good steering committee, and I will say having access to executive VPs in a very large organization, and there was even a tool group, having the tool group involved was important. So we had a very wide smattering, folks from QA, folks from development, folks from their tools and process group. We had people representing their Agile transformation, as well as the PPM group, and some general people that represented more of end users. That took us about 3 solid months to complete. And I think the biggest debate in that organization was trying to determine this balance, all the way from giving developers choice, which the development organization was 100% behind. They wanted to give their developers choice, and balancing that with this organization's need to track value across the entire organization. And they picked, in their instance, after going through all the importance of the different criteria, they picked a platform for all, I think it was about 4,000 users. That process took 3 months to decide. It was about 2 or 3 more months after that before they could actually finalize the purchase and put training in place. And they gave themselves about 6 months, maybe even 8, if I recall properly, to get this rolled out to everybody, because there was fairly big projects in place, and there also was a lot of data that had to be transferred between those platforms. So that was one that I felt really good about. The total process, I was only involved for about 6 months of it, but the total process went on another 6 months beyond that, and that was because of the large scale of it. Al, I know you've had some experiences. Why don't you go ahead and chime in here on anything you want to on some of these large scale platform implementations?
Yeah, one of the examples actually didn't so much use a tool as much as it's something a tool should do. It was something where it was kind of a mid-sized company, and I don't know, about 400 or 500 people in technology, IT actually. And when I'd gone in there to just kind of start with some lean agile, the big thing was clearly 2 problems they had, which was lack of visibility and a lack of an intake process, meaning they just were overloading things. And one of the first things we did was actually create on a whiteboard all the things that were in play in the organization, and it kind of astounded them. One person had just gone off and had listened to some of the things I was talking about, those 2 things, visibility of work and an intake process, and she put it on a board, and the impact was kind of dramatic. It was where people realized they had so many things in play. That was partly why they couldn't get anything done. So I've seen this also happen in tools. I mean, obviously, but it's really, to me, a requirement and an example that anytime you don't have that, you're not going to get the value of the tool. So the question is, how do I get what I'm working on visible in a tool where I can see it? I understand how big each of the pieces are, approximately anyway, and there's some sense of who's working on it. And when you get that to be visible in a tool where people can see it, it actually will have a big impact on things. So that's one example. And you have to make sure your tool can actually do that, because a lot of times they have things listed, but you really can't relate, well, who's working on this? So you have to have some connection from the top to the bottom.
That's great. I couldn't agree more. And I'm going to talk just one more large example I had an experience with. So this organization had lots of they weren't point tools, but they were separate installations of what I'll call team-based tools that didn't talk to each other. Their number one concern was the time to implementation, how quickly they could get a tool in place, and number two was cost. So right off the bat, the evaluation, probably I could tell when I got involved in this that we probably weren't going to come up with maybe the best tool for that organization. When we took into account that organization's needs, but then their desire to emphasize the cost and the short time frame to implement, I'll just say I believe they picked a non-optimal platform for that organization. And I was able to witness, and I think they went in pretty much with their mind made up. They tried to be objective, but looking at the people who made the decision, there wasn't enough open-mindedness at the start. So in that case, the implementation and rollout was done very quickly, but adoption rates were abysmal. Usage was confusing. No training was put in place. And it was really what I would pretty much call a failed platform implementation. And I don't know where they're at today, but this was well over a year ago. And at that point, even after many months, the tool wasn't being used properly. And I think an even bigger problem in that case was they didn't have a standardized agile process throughout the organization. So that's one thing I noticed. And I happened to go back through the notes while I was talking. I see that a lot of folks here on this presentation are agile coaches. And so one thing I think you can do as a coach is to really emphasize some of the points Al has brought up, is that we need to have across the organization an understanding of how we do things. What is the standard way across this organization of discussing things, and how do we make that visible? These are important things for use of any platform. I've done a lot of ISV type implementations in smaller independent software vendors or independent groups within a large organization. And frankly, the needs at these organizations are typically very different. The roll-up capabilities, the portfolio management capabilities tend to not be as intense. Usually they just need to get to a program level. And because there's only a few programs, they can do the rest of the roll-up manually. In these cases, you should be able to have a smaller group. I've typically worked with as 2 or 3 people typically. There usually are some team tools already in place. What I've seen is maybe the biggest problem you face is a not understanding of how non-technical users will get the data they need. ISVs tend to be more on the technical side and pick tools that are more aligned towards the developer QA team. And sometimes the platform is not accessible to product owners, business folks, and therefore they just don't use the tool, and maybe the prioritizations aren't occurring, and the change of priorities during a process. So keep that in mind, even for smaller organizations. Don't just rely on a tool that your developers and QA and Scrum Masters and product owners want. Think of the greater good. Make sure there's a way to get that data out to people who aren't technical. That's probably the biggest negative I've seen when folks have made a tool there. But in general, you should be able to get by with a more of a team-based tool that doesn't have some of the enterprise level capabilities. Al, is there anything else you want to add about any of these examples before we go into take people's questions?
Yeah, one last thing. When you talk about standards and things, and we're also talking about how tools should be providing information, but you're not following it, there is this temptation to think your tool is going to solve your problem and give you standards. And the answer is that's not going to happen. In fact, that's a failure I've seen a lot of times, not just with tools, but with frameworks. What you want tools in providing quote unquote standards is kind of what is the information we need, but how we get that is still up to the teams. We're still trying to be agile with this, and there still needs to be a degree of autonomy and self-organization. So just keep that in mind. The tool's kind of like the backbone of things, but it's not really going to tell you how to do things. It's telling you what information we've decided is useful.
That's great. And I think when you do that evaluation, since you know the information you think is useful, you have to decide if that particular platform or tool can provide that information. A lot of them have built-in work items or hierarchical relationships or limitations in what they can and can't do. So during your evaluation, be clear on that so you can assess those capabilities before you go ahead and put something in place. Great. I think we should open it up for questions now. So let's see if we have any. I'll wait about 30, 40 seconds here. And if you have anything, Kenzie, go ahead and just pass it on. And Al and I, one of us will be happy to answer it.
Awesome. I think, Greg, we should start with this question. What is a reasonable implementation time for a 100-person installation?
Yeah. I think just implementation, I'm saying 6 to 8 weeks is very reasonable. You could probably even do it in 4 weeks for a 100-person organization, but 6 to 8 is plenty of time to get your team set up, your relationship set up, get training in place, and to get that rolled out. That's a fairly simple process. The evaluation before that might take another 4 to 6 weeks, but the actual implementation should go quickly.
Awesome. Another one that we just got is we need to implement SAFe quickly. What kind of weight should framework readiness that have as a part of the selection process? Sorry.
Okay. So yeah, I'll just
that. And then the follow-up question is, what kind of impact on implementation time will that have?
Okay. So in summary, they want to implement SAFe quickly.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of weight should that framework readiness have as they evaluate? I'll start with that. I want to start with the fact that SAFe is a framework. That's the first thing that I want to emphasize. It's not a methodology or a process or a specific relationship. So when you look at the SAFe framework, most organizations I've looked at don't implement any more than 15 to 25% of it. I have been doing this for 10 years now. I've never seen an organization implement every single, if you look at the SAFe diagram, all those icons, every single part of it. It's a framework. So pick and choose what's important to you. That's the first answer to the question. Once you know the elements of the SAFe framework that you're going to implement in your lean agile process, then go ahead and see how a tool can support those. So it should have a heavy weighting, number one, if that's what you want to do on the portions of the SAFe framework that you're using it. What kind of impact will that have on your implementation time? I still think you could, I don't know the size of this organization, so I'll just throw a number out. If it's a 500 plus seat thing, you should still be able to do your assessment all in the neighborhood of 8 weeks, come up with, the key here is deciding which capabilities you need from the SAFe framework, deciding on those and ranking them, and then evaluating your tools. And that's, once again, probably maybe an 8-week implementation. So if I look at it from assessment to implementation, it's anywhere from 3 to 4 months is reasonable, maybe 5 months if it's a large organization. If we're talking, 3,000 or 4,000 seats or more, it's the real bottleneck to most implementations is when you can get teams off their existing tools. They typically have to close out a project, and some of my clients had projects that were going to last well over 12 or 15 months, and we didn't want to move their work out of it. So that's almost always the governor on how fast you can get all teams switched over.
I actually wanted to add something to this because I think the answer can be extended to not just SAFe, but any approach you're taking at mid to large scale. Two of the things that people extract out of SAFe a lot are the planning event, which is great for coordination, and I'll call it the intake process, which is what feeds the planning event, so you don't overload people. So when you're looking, if you're going into SAFe quickly, and you know that what you're trying to do is control the intake process and coordinate teams, then when you're looking for a tool, those should be the things you look at very closely, because that will have a very large downstream effect on anything after, the teams, DevOps, things like that, because you'll tend to not overload them as well. And not overloaded teams always work better than overloaded teams, regardless of what you're doing. So that's it.
Thanks, Al. It's great.
Cool. I've got another one, Greg.
Okay.
Do you see a difference in the selection of a tool when a company doesn't have an Agile framework, aka starting from scratch?
Well, I don't see any reason to get a tool until you determine what your framework is, because first thing to do is to bring in a coach or use your internal coaches and decide what that framework is before you go with any tool, because they're so different. So that's my first suggestion there is yes, is the short answer to that question. There's a shorter time frame, but first decide what your Agile process is before you even looking at tools. So bring in a coach, look at how you've worked in the past, what's going to work for your organization before you even start an assessment. And Al can probably expand on that as well.
Well, it's just the consistency we've had of saying you're always figuring out what you want to do first before you have a tool. That's all. It's just consistent with that.
Okay. Yep. Any others?
Do we have time for one more?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. What is the best way to find the existing independent industry analysis at the start of the investigation process?
Well, I think the two probably leading industry analysts, and Kenzie or Al, you can jump in as well, but I look at Gartner and Forrester as two of the leaders who covered both Agile work management platforms, Agile planning platforms, and PPM tools, where there's overlap there. I should point out the new PPM tools have changed where a lot of the Agile tools have that capability. But I would say I would start at Gartner and Forrester, get a hold of those reports. You can typically get them by going to one of the vendors' sites and sign up. And they'll give you a copy of those reports. That's a great way to start. And if your organization already has a relationship with Gartner or Forrester or any other industry analyst, just ask them. We are looking at putting a lean process in place, and we want to know what papers you have. So if you want to add to that, Al or Kenzie, please do.
Yeah, no, I don't. That's good.
Yeah, I agree with that, Greg.
Great. I don't see any other questions. So I guess what I'd like to just end with is, number one, thank you all for attending and listening. And if you have additional questions that you want to get out to either myself, my email is on the screen, gregjohnsoncolorado@gmail.com. Al's company website, as well as his email, is up there, as well as Targetprocess. I want to thank Targetprocess as well for putting this on. I think it's really valuable, and I'll let Kenzie wrap things up.
Actually, before she does, I want to just invite people. My company does a lot of mid and large scale transformation and technical stuff. If you've got questions about it, safe or not safe, please drop me an email. I love to chat to people.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Greg and Al. Just wanted to let everyone know that we will be sending out a follow-up email in the next few days with a recorded version of this webinar, a copy of the slides, and our tools assessment checklist, which will help guide you through your own version of the assessment process that we covered today. So if you have any additional questions or you would like to set up one-on-one time, just reach out to any of the email addresses on your screen. And we will be launching a quick survey right after the webinar, and we'd love to hear your feedback and your opinion on what topics we should cover in our next webinar. So please participate if you have an extra minute. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us.